Zoos originated from where they used to catch wild animals and give them as trophies or gifts to lots of wealthy people.
They were very much seen as something just to look at. There was no care for the welfare of the animal, what they needed. It was just they're going to stick it in the cages and exhibit, and then it can be shown off as a status symbol, really. It was a look what I've got.
People's perceptions of animals before weren't that great, really.
So I think that's changed quite a lot, is people's concept of how the animals should live and how they live in the wild.
I generally believe you can see a massive change in zoos in the last 30 years. I always say to people, zoos are like Marmite in today's world. You either love them or you hate them.
There's no reason to say that good zoos can't meet some of the needs of animals, of most animals, but can they meet all of them? And I genuinely, it's very difficult to talk in generalities. I think there are some key high-profile species that show exactly where the problems lie.
We know very well that animals form part of very, very complex habitats and ecosystems, not just on a biological level, but on a behavioural level in the way they interact with each other. And that is obviously taken away in zoos to a large extent. Animals can't carry out their behavioural repertoire in captivity, it's just not possible.
Stereotypical behaviour is what's most commonly associated with this, and that is repetitive, functionless behaviour that has no real purpose.
So things like rocking, self-harming, feather plucking, fur plucking, these behaviours are not occurring in the wild, so it is something which is very closely linked to captivity.
In themselves, stereotypies are not necessarily bad. They are bad for zoos from the viewpoint that when people see them, they think there's something wrong, and their obvious assumption is that there is something wrong with the animal now. We can't come to that conclusion because we don't know what the causal factor of that stereotypy is. It could be that it's something that happened to the animal way back in its infancy, or it may be that the environment that it's living in really is suboptimal. But in that case, why is the animal doing it? Maybe this is the way it copes, and it may be that the animal has a reasonable welfare because it's doing the stereotypy, in which case our concern should be to try and identify what aspect of the environment, if any, is causing that stereotypy.
There are two schools of thought on the sort of underlying causes of stereotypic behaviour. One is the school of thought that really comes from ethologists, which is that stereotypic behaviours are essentially the animal trying to cope with adverse environmental conditions, specifically that they are the result of highly motivated behaviours that animal has not been able to perform. So, for example, a predator, chasing and capturing and killing its prey before it eats it. So those are highly motivated behaviours that the animal's evolved to perform. It doesn't have to sit and think about it. That's behaviours that animal has evolved to perform. If it didn't do those, it wouldn't be able to survive in the wild. So if you then put the animal in a position that it doesn't need to perform those behaviours, ethologists would argue that those behaviours still have to be performed, so the animal has all this kind of energy that it has to displace in another way, and ethologists would say that is what the sort of root cause of stereotypy is. Theories now, sort of more current theories, and in fact my own theory of stereotypic behaviour, and one that's shared by a lot of other people, is that stereotypic behaviour results from brain dysfunction that is a result of stress, but the correlation between stress at the time that the behaviour is being performed and the actual behaviour itself is inconsequential. So what we're saying is that although stress may have caused that behaviour to develop in the first place, it's not perpetuating it or maintaining it.
At what point does that become a welfare problem? That's the question that we really need to ask, because stress is an ordinary everyday part of life. We all have stress. Just go to an airport and look at what people are doing there. You will see stereotypies, you will see self-directed behaviours, you will see all of it there. But if you ask those people, are they stressed, they'll probably say, yeah, I've got a plane in half an hour and I don't know where to go. But if you ask them, yeah, but is your welfare bad? Do you feel bad about life? Oh no, I'm going on holiday. There is a difference between being stressed and having a poor quality of life or poor welfare. So we need to know at what stage chronic stress becomes a welfare problem.
When an animal first starts performing stereotypic behaviour, it's quite difficult to know precisely what is causing that, simply because it's not ethical really to make an animal stereotypic in order to see what started that animal performing that behaviour. So for the same ways it's difficult to know what starts a person having depression. You can't go and make people depressed in order to test that hypothesis. There has been some work done on this with animals, looking at what triggers might be there for the beginnings of stereotypy. So in a sense, we think of stereotypic behaviour in terms of the animal has a predisposition to it. So for example, might have a genetic predisposition towards developing stereotypy, then something stressful happens in the environment and then the behaviour starts. So you then get changes in the psychological aspects of the animal. So it might be that they've gone from being in a stable sense to being slightly more sort of negatively negative affective state, if you like. So they've gone from being, okay, this is all right, to being, oh, I don't really like this. And so it's at that stage where they start not being able to cope with their environment, and that's when the behaviour seems to start.
There are ways of trying to identify whether an animal has a negative bias or a positive bias, and you can do that by, for example, setting up experiments whereby they can learn to expect a certain outcome from things that they do. And if you then don't supply that outcome, how does the animal behave? As it behaves in that way, then it has a negative cognitive bias. But if it responds in that way, then it's likely to have a positive cognitive bias. With those sorts of tests, it's possible to find out something about how these animals view their position and how they view the world.
Assessing animal emotion has been something that people have been trying to do for decades, centuries in fact.
The psychology tradition closed itself down very early by denying that animals had any mental life at all.
Everyone accepts that animals are able to, experience pain in one way or another, and they will seek pleasurable things over unpleasurable things, right? So they are able to. They're not just automatons like machines, right? Animals are capable of positive and negative things. I think the real issue in psychology and understanding animal emotions is what the sort of phenomenology of that is. So how an animal experiences emotion, what that means. So for a human to experience emotion, we're all fairly familiar with what that's like, right? So we know what it feels like to be happy, we know what it feels like to be sad or frightened or whatever. For an animal, we don't know how that translates, right? We don't know how an animal experiences those things. The things that we find pleasurable and unpleasant, maybe animals find pleasurable and unpleasant as well, but we don't know how they experience that, whether they have feelings for it, whether it's a physical thing and that's it, or whether it's just an automatic response. There's something bad, I need to get away from it, or there's something good, I need to get more of it. So we don't know what their sort of cognitive interpretation of that is. Whether they experience pain in an emotional sense in the same way that humans do, it's very difficult to test that, right? You can't do that without language necessarily, according to some people. So things like cognitive bias testing and ways of experiencing or ways of testing general kind of cognition and general affective state and general kind of well-being and personality in animals may help us to understand this in the future. But at the moment, you know, there's still not consensus to how animals experience emotion.
Clearly with zoo animals it would be very, very useful to know what sort of cognitive bias they have. I mean, apart from anything else, it would help enormously in setting up enrichments for them, in deciding what sort of housing and husbandry they needed. But also it allows us to get to the individual level where we can tailor our housing and husbandry to the individuals in a group, rather than have the one-for-all type of thing that we've grown accustomed to.
The best place to start with any discussion of what an animal needs in captivity is what it has in the wild, or what it should have in the wild.
What zoos will typically do is have enrichment programs whereby they introduce, for example, foraging substrates or complexity into the environment of the animals to try to mimic their sort of more natural foraging environment.
Enrichment programs are just very simply finding different methods to stimulate and enrich your animals that are great in terms of for them being able to show naturalistic behaviour, but also for our point of view as well. It helps you to do research on the animals, figure out new things about them. One of the things that I absolutely love doing with the jaguars, for example, is tying the food up from these big poles that are in the enclosure.
And it's just all a way of keeping them mentally active and physically active and helping them perform the behaviours that they would perform in the wild. So it does them the world of good if we can try and encourage those natural behaviours. And if we have to use something artificial to do that, then that's fine too.
Under those best circumstances where we have good housing and husbandry, good enclosures that are tailored as best as they can be to the animal's natural biology, then we are giving the animals the opportunity to express as many as possible of their naturalistic behaviours. We cannot ever duplicate the wild environment in captivity. We can never ever do that. We can simulate some of these things as best we can through appropriate enrichment, but for the things that we can't simulate, we then have to ask the question, do they matter that much to the animal? If they do, then the logical conclusion is that there just might be some species that we must not keep in captivity because they're not amenable to captivity. It's possible that the polar bear is one of those species.
We know their home ranges, we know their behaviour in the wild, so it stands to reason now that we know that that's not the right place for them to be. One of the other things is for sort of predators is that they're living in habitats and environments where they can't fulfil a very basic need of theirs, which is to hunt. You know, so if the predator-prey relationship is distorted, and whilst of course, you know, it would be very stressful to be a prey animal, it's also part of their biological makeup, and that's, you know, living in herds and interacting with their surroundings, and that's all taken away.
The bottom line is, taking an elephant has evolved to live in an elephant's environment. It hasn't evolved to cope with what goes on in a zoo. It might cope, given certain provisions, but is coping what we really want? Do we want these animals to have to cope, or do we want them to have a good life? And I think it's about giving them the opportunity to live a good and natural life.
There are other species that thrive well in captivity and seem to be flexible enough to happily live in a range of different enclosure conditions. Ring-tailed lemurs do very well in captivity, and we have them in traditional enclosures, free-range enclosures, walk-through enclosures, pretty much loose in some zoos to go where they please. They don't appear to show any abnormal behaviours or any stereotypies. They seem to just thrive in captivity. We wouldn't easily be able to predict those things from our knowledge of the basic biology of these animals, but the beginnings of that prediction are there, and the best approach to that so far is the one that Georgia Mason did with the home ranges, where she plotted home range size against stereotypies and found that the animals that were most likely to show stereotypies were those that had a very, very large home range size. That sort of approach offers the possibility of us to start thinking about predicting which kinds of animals maybe are suited and which kinds of animals are not suited to living in captivity. But it's not the case that you can go and stand in front of an enclosure at the zoo, look at an animal and say, God, he looks bored. You can't do that.
Because whenever you watch a documentary, you see an animal doing something awesome. You know, big cats are among the laziest animals in the world. To be quite honest, if they had the necessities in life, they wouldn't move. There was actually some research that was carried out on a pride of lions in Africa, and it showed that because they had this watering hole that they basically watched over, they didn't move from that area. Their territory was a mile in any given direction at most, because they just sat there. They knew that all the food would have to come to them because they got a watering hole there. Even though it's probably boring for the public to look at, by us looking at our lions or tigers asleep, it's a great natural behaviour because they sleep 20 hours a day in the wild anyway.
We need to know what they do in the wild, not just one study in the wild, but lots of different wild, because different wild places, the animals can live quite a different life in them. We need to know the full range of behavioural flexibility that the animal shows, and we need to know that what they're doing in the zoo is within that range of behavioural flexibility.
As scientists, we probably owe it to the animals as much as we sort of owe it to our own sense of sort of intellectual challenge, just try and understand these behaviours and what motivates them and what maintains them.
I think as a country we're fairly good in how we look after our animals.
That does not apply to the dreadful places that I've seen. Captivity is a very broad church. It ranges from, you know, well-funded, well-intentioned zoos through to some absolutely genuinely terrible places. Not always that far away from home. Quite a lot of them are on our back, on our doorstep.
Ultimately, everyone can accept that zoos are visitor attractions, so obviously if there weren't to be the people visiting the zoos, then there wouldn't be the demand for them and the zoos would gradually sort of disappear. So I think the public have a huge part to play in controlling the industry. You know, it's supply and demand, as with anything else. If people didn't want to go to the zoo, then the zoos wouldn't exist. There would be a gap. I think that would need to be filled with something. We're asked this a lot, you know, well, if there weren't zoos, how would my child learn about animals? But I think there are alternatives. You know, we have amazing nature documentaries. There's incredible plans, actually. There's projects going on at the moment which are looking at virtual zoos where you can go and have this sort of immersive experience. There's things, technology being developed. You look at people spending, you know, a few seconds, a few minutes outside an enclosure. What are they really learning, or are they just wondering, is it just a nice day out? So I think there's a lot of opportunities, but I think it probably takes the zoo industry to start kind of thinking outside the box, if you like.
To be honest with you, even though my family own 2 wildlife parks and I've grown up in wildlife parks, I wouldn't necessarily say I agree with them. I think zoos I suppose the easiest way to put it is they're kind of like a necessary evil in some way, because every keeper in the world will happily admit that if we didn't need zoos, we wouldn't have them. We don't necessarily want to see these animals in captivity. It's just there isn't a wild anymore, and that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And I think that because there's still this massive kind of mindset that the wild is still this massive open area that no one touches upon or encroaches on, that when you see an animal in captivity, it can look quite horrible to a lot of people. They don't want to focus on that kind of stuff. So the easy target is zoos, because obviously the animals are a lot closer. You can see more what's going on. But you look at what goes on out in the wild. Rhinos, for example, at the moment, they're under 24-hour surveillance wherever they are. A lot of places are now fenced in. Like a lot of these game reserves have now got fences around them, or bodyguards for a lot of these animals. And you think to yourself, that isn't wild. And I think that's the thing that zoos and us as professionals need to kind of open the public eyes about a lot more in the next coming years. The fact that we're kind of too late in a way to save the natural world in some degree.
The world changes at such a rapid pace. The way animals cope with the changes is also going to change along the way as well. So I don't think you can ever stop researching. I don't think we'll ever find out everything there is to know about all the animals we keep in captivity.
From the point of view of public perceptions of animals, I think people probably are unaware of the sheer number of things that can affect animal behaviour and how to interpret what you see in animal behaviour. It's a thing that takes a long time to get to grips with, and I don't think there are very many avenues within our popular culture for getting that kind of information across. I personally would like to see more zoos being a bit more upfront with some of the behavioural problems that their animals have got.
I'd like to see a little bit more sort of people power, consumer demand. If you're not happy with what's happening in zoos, tell the zoo, tell the licensing authority if it's in the UK or around Europe, tell whoever the hell's responsible, tell the government, tell the pub, tell your friends that there's something you're not happy about. Ask the questions of what you've seen. If you see an animal that you think is distressed, tell the zoo, ask the zoo.
The motivation of most people that deal with animals is very good, and so we, as scientists, what we're trying to do is use scientific evidence to try to ensure that the animals have the best provisions that they can, and also to ensure the best science is carried out with those animals.
This is the time where the profession needs to come together. Whether you're animal rights, whether you're a conservation charity, whether you're a zoo, at the end of the day, we're all aiming for the same thing. It's something that I've never been able to get my head around, why we're all against each other so much. We all want to save animals, we all love animals.
So when we say zoochosis, I think we should use the word sparingly, but I think it's a great little phrase.